Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrell. The election of Donald Trump has brought many dramatic changes in society south of the border, with anti-immigrant policies leading to ICE raids and deportations, the DOGE cuts to U.S. aid and other institutions, his so-called anti-woke policies against DEI, with many major corporations and educational institutions in the United States rolling back their DEI policies and programs for fear of retribution from the Trump administration. Some of that has already seeped over the border into Canada, with top sponsors of the nonprofit Pride Toronto, with well-known brands like Google, Home Depot, Nissan, and Clorox pulling out of their sponsorships. We wondered if there were other impacts on Canada's nonprofit sector that we should be keeping a close eye on. To help us unpack some of the latest developments, please welcome Dr. Wendy Cukier, the founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute at the Toronto Metropolitan University. An award-winning diversity leader and best-selling author, Wendy also leads the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub and is the academic research director for the Future Skills Center. Welcome back to the podcast, Wendy.
Thanks for having me.
And how would you describe the key differences and similarities between the DEI landscape in Canada and the United States? Are we truly insulated from the backlash, or are we more connected than we think?
Depends on what you're talking about. So what I would start with is by reinforcing that our institutions, our Constitution, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, our various legislative frameworks, our jurisprudence, our provincial human rights legislation, our disability legislation at the federal and provincial level, all of those are solid and unchanged. And I think that there's certainly challenges for organizations that operate cross-border because they're trying to figure out how to navigate the realities in Canada and the United States. But where we see, in my view, dangerous spillover is really in the media and the discourse. And you alluded to some of the examples of that. I'm seeing in a lot of major corporations, for example, silence on important issues where leaders previously would have spoken out. What's interesting, though, is when you survey Canadians, and we just did a survey of more than 5,000 Canadian workers, most of them think that the level of commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion is appropriate, or we need more of it. A relatively small percentage, about 15, think that there's too much focus on EDI. So we see a situation where the discourse, in my view, reflects very much what we see in the United States. But the reality in Canada is very different, and we need to double down and make sure that people understand that.
That's fascinating, and I sure would love to take a closer look at that research that you just spoke of. What are the most significant ripple effects you're seeing in Canada as the U.S. rolls back DEI policies?
Well, I think some of them you've alluded to, where we're dealing with multinationals that are operating in Canada and the U.S. They're having to navigate the complexity of doing business there and doing business here. So there's no question that some of those large corporations that are rolling back policies in the U.S. are at least muting their commitments in Canada. But remember, despite the executive orders and despite the high profile attacks on women, the revival of masculine energy, the attacks on immigrants, on trans people, on pretty well all of the equity deserving groups that we have focused on for recent years. Despite those attacks in the US, we're seeing corporations stand up to the president, arguing that this has nothing to do with wokeness. It has to do with good business, because as markets change, so do your policies. As the labor supply changes, so do your recruitment and retention strategies and so on. So we have to make sure that we don't let the loudest voices mislead us into what's really going on. And the other thing that is critically important is, of course, the courts are still not all aligned in terms of what Donald Trump is trying to do. I think where the courts have created problems is specifically around affirmative action. And those are programs which are targeting equity deserving groups. And for example, saying a portion of funding, a portion of positions will be reserved for certain populations. But that's a relatively small percentage of what we consider to be effective equity, diversity, and inclusion policies. And so it is important to keep an eye on the spillover effects from the US, but also to recognize, as I said, our institutions are solid, and organizations that ignore their obligations under law are setting themselves up for huge risks.
So I'm curious whether you have sort of examples, or whether, at least in sort of a larger sense, how Canadian organizations are reacting to these rollbacks in the United States, especially those with US based funders or corporate partners. I mean, what have you seen?
Well, we've certainly we've seen retreats. I mean, one of the most notable ones, in my view, was McCarthy Tetro, that canceled its program for Black and Indigenous lawyers, because for sure we have more than enough Black and Indigenous lawyers. Look at the numbers. We don't. Um, and as a result, the chief inclusion officer left the firm. University of Alberta is one of the organizations that rebranded its diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. Um, if I were in Alberta, maybe I'd be hiding for ducking for cover as well. I'm not sure, but it is important to recognize that equity is a requirement under Canadian law. Diversity is a reality that we see in the changing demographics of Canada, and inclusion is how you get the best out of the people who work for you. So there isn't anything, in my view, that justifies, quote, rebranding in order to avoid backlash. We also see that large and important companies, Shopify, for instance, joined with the tech bros in the United States, saying it was retreating from equity, diversity, and inclusion. But what was interesting about that was the counter backlash, where a huge number, nearly 400 tech entrepreneurs and executives, signed an open letter criticizing the equity, diversity, and inclusion retreat. So often these individual examples get a lot of attention. But as I said, the majority of Canadians are not with that program. The majority of Canadians, 54%, think that focusing on increasing DEI work is a good thing. 27% are neutral, and only 16% say it's a bad thing. That's a massive majority of Canadians who are committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so, often the outliers are the ones that make the news, and we need to focus more attention on those who are staying the course. The other thing that is so important from my perspective, and this isn't getting enough attention, so I'm going to say it again. We have a trade war with the United States. What is the response we need? Well, there's more focus on self-sufficiency for sure, but one of the things we need to do is take advantage of our free trade agreements with Asia Pacific, with the European Union, with Africa and others. And what's the best way to do that? Leveraging our immigrant diaspora. And so, in my mind, despite all of the talk about immigration levels and the backlash that's focusing on immigrants, many of them racialized, immigrants are our competitive advantage globally when it comes to expanding brand Canada and entering new markets. So we're really doubling down on what is often referred to as the business case, because that has not changed. The rhetoric may have changed, but the reality is Canada is diverse. Organizations serving Canadians have to understand how to serve Indigenous peoples, racialized peoples, persons with disabilities, women, and so on. And organizations that want to recruit the best and the brightest need to be able to attract people from those communities and retain them. That hasn't changed. The fact that diverse populations are associated with increased innovation and entrepreneurship, that hasn't changed. They see things often in different ways because of their different lived experience. And as I said, if that's not enough for you, the risks of retreating are quite considerable because from what we've seen, the courts are still very solidly behind our commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion from a human rights perspective, but also from a safe workplace perspective.
And turning now to, I guess, looking at the folks that are impacted by some of these rollbacks or these movements of, I guess, withdrawing from commitments. Are you seeing specific communities or populations such as Indigenous, Black, or 2S LGBTQ plus peoples being disproportionately affected or by these shifts in tone and investment? You mentioned, of course, McCarthy Tetra, which is a really important example. Are there any other examples?
Well, I think you mentioned at the outset the many sponsors withdrawing from Pride. I've talked to a lot of people about that, and some view it as a function of backlash. Some also view it as a shift in Pride's focus and issues. So I think that's a fairly complex one, but certainly we've seen open attacks on trans people in Canada as in the United States. We've seen a number of provinces backtrack in the commitments to gender equality and sexual orientation, specifically with respect to trans populations and people questioning whether or not there's more than two gender identities, for instance. And that's very troublesome because, in my view, you need to look at the most vulnerable and recognize that, first they come for them and then they may come for you. And so it's very important, in my view, in this current environment to link arms and stand together, because you may not be trans, your child may not be trans, your best friend may not be trans, but if trans people become a focus of backlash, it's only a matter of time before other segments of the population are attacked. We've seen, in my view, a big shift in attitudes to immigration, and I think that that is partly a function of backlash, partly a function of very deliberate misinformation. And we know that, for example, the inquiry into foreign interference highlighted some of the influencers who were being paid by foreign governments. And many of them really, really dug in on the anti-immigrant rhetoric, in part because it is so divisive. I would say, I've been in a couple of meetings recently that left me gobsmacked where, and strangely, younger women suggesting that gender is done and, we can stop talking about women's rights and need to focus on, more pressing matters. And when you look at the data actually suggests that not a lot has changed since, Governor Ann Richards said that Fred Astaire did everything that Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, backwards and in high heels. So the fact that women are still held to a higher standard, and we see lots of evidence of that continuing, I'm really concerned that not so much the overt misogyny and attacks on women, but the idea that it's done and we've accomplished everything we need to simply flies in the face of evidence. And of course, persons with disabilities, we've made a lot of progress in understanding the definition of disabilities and broadening that definition to include mental health issues and cognitive differences. But again, very vulnerable group. I have not seen as much evidence of backtracking with respect to those commitments as I've seen with respect to other groups. And thankfully, in my view, the commitments around truth and reconciliation and Indigenous peoples seem relatively strong. I mean, there are debates around governance and consultations and so on. But if you look at where the federal government is investing, there still seem to be good high levels of commitment there. And I'm seeing with a lot of private sector corporations, especially those that have aspirations for mega projects, that they're not backing off at all on their commitments to Indigenous peoples. So I think it varies. You know, the backlash against immigrants and racialized people, I think, is acute. And certainly the backlash against the trans community is something we can't ignore.
Yes, and that's really a fantastic analysis. And I also share your concern about this idea that that women's rights, the fight for the rights of women in the workplace and to control their body is over when you see literally the loss of that control of their human reproductive rights in the United States. Is to me it's stunning, and that it occurred, and if that doesn't show you how rights can be withdrawn easily, I don't know what would.
Yeah. And the other thing, of course, is hate crimes. And we've seen spikes in hate crimes against South Asian communities, spikes in hate crimes against the Jewish community and Muslim communities. And I would argue that violence against women is effectively a hate crime. And that has increased as well as the attacks on trans people and so on. So you know, physical violence is kind of the tip of the iceberg in some respects, and we've seen spikes in a lot of manifestations of violence against the populations we're talking about. The next layer is, of course, overt discrimination, and then systemic discrimination, and then microaggressions. So when I see a big spike in hate crimes, I worry that other forms of discrimination are also increasing. And certainly, I would observe, and I don't know if you've seen this as well, people are saying things, I think, feeling legitimized by, the President of the United States. I've heard people say things that I hadn't heard in 20 years. I've seen organizations do things I haven't seen organizations do in many years, having panels, for example, that are all white men, or giving prizes where most of the recipients are men, and uh, and there's very little representation. Like in recent years, corporations were very sensitive to those things. The idea of no more manels, and so there are these subtle shifts along with the silence. And I think that for me is the biggest concern, that we aren't seeing corporate leaders stand up and aggressively assert their commitments in the way that they did even 3 or 4 years ago, with the exception of that blowback Shopify got, which I thought was fantastic. So we really need leaders to speak out, and it's leaders not just in the nonprofit sector, although that's obviously important, but we really need to hold corporations' feet to the fire around standing up for equity, diversity, and inclusion, not as wokeness, but as good business practice.
Yeah, and I'd like to lean into that idea of really the silence that you're speaking about, and that the lack of basically being silent in the face of these challenges to equity deserving groups. Is it possible that some of the nonprofits may be softening their DEI messaging to avoid controversy, or they're afraid of losing donors or even grants from their funders? What are the long-term risks of that kind of dilution of the support for DEI?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It does have ripple effects. So there was a study done, you probably have talked about it in another call or podcast, but Charity Insights Canada did a survey in 2025, just a few months ago. So it's very, very current. And it said charities have experienced reduced funding, as well as, increased demands, which is not entirely a surprise. 1% said that they had decreased their focus on EDI over the past year. 8% said it was never a priority. But some organizations are actually doubling down on their commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion because they see the writing on the wall. So again, I wouldn't say that that the backsliding is pronounced in the nonprofit sector, but we are seeing subtle signs of less focus on it, and that applies to universities as well as hospitals and other organizations in the kind of quasi government sector, in particular, I think.
In this climate, how can nonprofits protect systemic EDI work from becoming performative or, at worst, disposable?
Well, I have always said that if your EDI work is just bolted on in a checklist, it's really easy to unbolt it and cut it from your organization. In my view, the most effective EDI strategy is one that is completely embedded in your corporate strategy, because as I said, population of Canada is becoming more diverse. That means your client base is becoming more diverse. That means your talent pool is becoming more diverse. That means you need to understand new ways of doing things and thinking. And the risk management hasn't changed. So I think what organizations that are serious about this need to do is make sure that those arguments are the arguments that they're leading with. That social justice, commitment to human rights, of course, are foundational. But if you're talking to people who don't necessarily get it, you have to find language and ways to communicate that will help them understand that this is not about wokeness, political correctness, or a particular stripe of politics. This is simply about being effective. And whether it's making sure that the research that you do has a gender and diversity lens to ensure that it reflects the full population, making sure the services that you develop have an EDI lens to them, so it's clear that they're serving the full range of Canadians in your community, making sure that your outreach approaches are getting where they need to get to. Like, all of those things to me are fundamentally doing a good job at what you're set up to do. And they require having an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens. If all you've done is focused on, counting, or waving a flag on during Pride Week, or celebrating Black History Month, chances are you you don't have the same deep commitments to EDI that organizations that have done the hard work of embedding it in their strategy have. And one of the things that for me has long been a concern, and we've talked about this, it's ironic because we do a lot of EDI training, is that training is the least effective way of changing behavior. And we really need to get into the organization and the strategy and embed the commitments to truth and reconciliation, equity, diversity, and inclusion at every stage. It's not just an HR issue. It's not even just a culture issue. It's a question of thinking about your programs, your policies, thinking about your donors, thinking about your partners in a very intentional way.
And that leads me to my next question, which is really how should nonprofit boards and leadership teams respond if donors or funders question the value of their EDI programs, or worse, oppose it outright?
Well, again, I would. So, what's an example of an EDI program that someone might consider? So, I was on the chair of the board of Women's College Hospital, and there was a big focus on Indigenous women's health. So, someone might look at that and say, "Oh, that's EDI." What I would say, that's about health equity. That's about ensuring that Indigenous women have access to health care. To me, there's nothing politically correct about that. It's about fulfilling Women's College Hospital's mandate, which is to serve women. Or we think about, I'll stick with healthcare just because I've been thinking a lot about it lately. Um, Kwame McKenzie at the Wellesley Institute shows concretely that the focus on the Black community during the pandemic and having specific targeted outreach to the Black community during the pandemic decreased the infection rates in the Black community from 9 times the rest of the population to about parity. Think about that. Focusing on the Black community in rolling out vaccinations was all about achieving the mandate of reducing COVID infections and death. It wasn't about, checking a box. If we think about, I'm trying to think of what other organizations we've worked with recently. A lot of them are in healthcare, but even if you're a professional association, say you're the Professional Engineers of Ontario, which is a nonprofit, but it's a professional organization. Very high percentage of engineers in Canada were internationally educated. Very high percentage of engineers are racialized. Increasing proportions of engineers are women, and they have different needs, different experiences. And if the Professional Engineers of Ontario doesn't address those needs, they are not serving their mandate. And, we could go through kind of example by example by example of organizations in the nonprofit sector. And I'd be hard pressed to think of any where equity, diversity, and inclusion wasn't a rational business decision, given their mandate and the population that they serve.
And what advice would you give nonprofit leaders who are feeling uncertain in how to continue this work without losing funding or stakeholder trust?
I think there's a need, and I know Charity Village helps a lot with this, but I think there is a need um, to encourage more conversations across the sector. And I say that because, we've done a few events recently looking at backlash, and one of them had 800 people register. And what that told me was that a lot of people are feeling very uncertain and unclear about what to do next. And we need to get people together to reinforce, the key messages, the evidence, and share best practices. Because at the end of the day, the challenge in doing this work is not so much preaching to the converted as making sure that people who may not have equity, diversity, and inclusion front and center of their work every day, um, figuring out how to ensure that they understand that this is critically important. And, there are we have lots of examples of how different large nonprofits, but also smaller nonprofits that are considered, quote, mainstream, have embedded equity, diversity, and inclusion into their operations because it ensures that they serve Canadians. And that's critically important because it ensures that they are able to, as I said, attract and retain the best and the brightest. So I think a lot is dependent on having, conversations around these topics and sharing best practices and having leaders. Like, we really, in my view, have to call on our political leaders, our corporate leaders, and our leaders of big nonprofits to clearly articulate why this is so important and to share the data and the evidence. I mean, you would know one of the problems, frankly, with the media is they like controversy. So they will often say, so and so says this, and so says that. Now, so and so saying this may represent like 1% of the nonprofits that are rolling back their commitments to EDI. And so who said that may represent the other 92% who have EDI programs. But they're often presented as equally valid and representative, and that can create real distortions in people's understanding of where Canadians are, where leaders are, and where the money is, frankly. And I think we have to work harder to just reinforce the arguments and remind people why we are doing this, and of course our fundamental commitments as Canadians, which are not going away in a hurry.
And given the growing polarization around equity issues, what can Canadian nonprofit leaders do to proactively safeguard and advance EDI in their organizations and the sector at large?
I think there are sort of two strategies. One is making sure that you as a leader are articulating clearly and concisely why this is a I'll use the word business. I know nonprofits don't don't use that language, but why this is an organizational priority, why this is a commitment that stems from the organization's mission and mandate. And I think as a leader, you set the tone, and you can't say that often enough to make sure that every single person in your organization really understands what they're doing and why they're doing it. So that's one piece, because often you have organizations that have commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion that on paper look great, but have not actually been socialized through the organization. People go for a couple of training sessions, check a box, and think they're done. And so, the hard work of really embedding EDI into the fabric of everything you do in your organization is critical. The second thing then is the outward focus and making sure that everybody you're interacting with, whether it's government, whether it's donors, whether it's partners, whether it's the sector at large, also understands why you're doing what you're doing, and looking for allies, like really trying, many of you have boards of directors with the, captains of industry, and making sure that they become ambassadors for your organization, but also for the commitments around equity, diversity, and inclusion. Super important. And I think making sure that you're talking their language, that you're communicating to them in ways that they will be able to internalize it and share it is really important, because most nonprofit leaders have lots of touch points where they can be exerting their influence. And I think the absolute worst thing that could happen is if a leader gets some pushback from their board or from some of their staff and then capitulates. And honestly, I've seen that in very unexpected places. And now is a time for courage, not for cowardice. And we have to really stick our courage in the sticking place, and stand up for not just what we believe in, but what is necessary, what is absolutely necessary to fulfill the mission and mandate of the nonprofit sector.
And finally, what gives you hope? Are there strategies or coalitions you're seeing in the Canadian sector that point towards resilience and progress despite these pressures?
Well, certainly in the US, there are lots of people fighting back against the EDI proposals. They're fighting in the courts. They're making the arguments of they're making the arguments about business reasons, like shareholders of 30 of the world's largest corporations have defeated all of the anti-DEI proposals in 2025. There's a great list of those. In Canada, as that survey shows, there are some charities and nonprofits that are retreating, and certainly I've met with some of them. I explained that said, gender is done, and the backlash is because we went too far, and we need to regroup and think about how to win the hearts of the the anti woke crowd and so on. I think that's a losing strategy in the long term for the reasons I said. You know, they may be focused on trans people right now, and you may not see trans people as core to your constituency or core to your employees. But make no mistake about it, they'll pick off the groups one at a time. So, but remember that survey 1% of nonprofits are backing off, 8% say they were never committed in the first place. And the rest, over 90%, are effectively staying the course. So that gives me hope. And, I have to say it's always glass half empty, half full. Every week, I have conversations with people that make me feel like, I'm tilting at windmills. I've been doing this too long. I'm irrelevant, and it's time to find a beach somewhere. And then I'll hear from someone who says, the work you're doing is important. Here is the impact, and thank you very much. And that sort of keeps me going. But I would say a lot of folks who work on equity, diversity, and inclusion are feeling under siege right now. And we really have to find ways to regroup and support. And again, focus on the business case. Focus on why this is critical for the organization to fulfill its mandate, because for me, that's the winning argument.
Well, Wendy, um, you are doing incredibly important work, and I think it's more important now than virtually ever, in at least in recent history. And as always, it's fascinating speaking with you about the nonprofit sector and equity issues. Your expertise and insight on so many aspects of this are invaluable to hear, especially during these really, really challenging times. Thank you for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Mary, thanks always for including me. I really appreciate the conversation.